Hey there guys, it's Metro, and today we're taking a look at healers within 5-mans, especially Mythic plus 5-mans. Going to be doing a tier list ranking them from number 1 through 6, giving my opinions on why they're in the ranking, and hopefully having a good discussion here in the comments like always. Once again, I'll remind you guys that this is purely my opinion based on some theory and experience, especially talking to other players who have played the spec a lot. If you have any disagreement, I'm totally understanding of that. Just please actually give your opinions and we can have a good discussion about that. But anyway, this tier list is relevant for November 14th and onward, patch 7.1, a few days prior to the day the legendaries got buffed, and the first week Trial of Valor has Mythic for reference. So also want to bring up that this is easily the most balanced all healers have ever been, especially in terms of 5-man content. Previous expansions, there was always one clear favorite that dominated, and then pretty much everything else was very low tier compared to it. But this time I'd say almost all the healing specs are within a few percentage of each other in terms of actual healing. The only difference that we're making the distinction on here is what type of utility and situational usage each spec can have. So just because I have one healer at number 1 and one healer at number 6 does not mean the number 6 is extremely worse in any way than any other healer on the list, and it does not mean that number 1 healer is the only option in order to be able to complete Mythic Plus dungeons. If you guys have any questions about any of this stuff, let me know. Otherwise, let's get right into the tier list. Tier 1, number 1 overall is of course Resto Druid. And this is mostly because the hot model they have synergizes extremely well with the current tanking model. It really goes perfectly with any type of active mitigation or staggering of damage and can really make healing very simple in 5-mans. They also have great on the move heals, which means you almost never have to stop as a healer or a tank, and you definitely never have to wait for the healer to top you off before you start a dangerous pull coming up. Tranquility as well remains among the highest impact 5-man cooldowns, and now can be fully cast on the move with a golden trait that every Resto Druid should have. Iron Bark is probably the most usable external, as it always reduces the damage irrelevant to the affix, and it's got a pretty good low CD. Bark Skin is a sizable defensive, and a defensive is something that cannot be taken for granted anymore as the dungeons get harder and harder as you progress. Innervate actually means they should never have to drink if used properly, although it is kind of baked into their kit and does not have a great impact. They also have great mobility in general on top of on the move heals with Dash and Displacer Beast, two things that I think any other spec would love to have even one of. Their damage is weaker than it once was after losing Heart of the Wild coming into Legion, but the affinities allow some fun and interesting ways to do damage at a higher cost. So people will constantly try the Bombkin or the Feral one and get varying results out of them, but regardless, damage is still possible. In terms of utility, they have easily the best out of any other healer. Battle Res can be invaluable, especially as a healer. As we mentioned in the tank tier list, sometimes when the tank dies, that's it. But as a healer, if you can battle res the tank immediately, which is already your focus, then you could easily get him up and prevent a wipe. Ursul's Vortex is second only to Gorfine's Grasp in terms of usefulness, especially for mobs in certain dungeons that have a propensity to leave melee constantly. Roots as well can be very useful in some dungeons, especially Black Rook Hold, and Typhoon can be coupled with Vortex as an AoE interrupt. It also should be noted that the Druid healing model almost entirely negates the overflowing affix, as any healing that does overheal is just taken directly off again with a hot. Tier 1, number 2 overall is Restoration Shaman. Their mastery can be outstanding in the current active mitigation model, one where tanks are fine sitting at low health for a while and then can easily be healed back up with the bonus. They also have amazing CD coverage, easily the best of any healer, including the single best CD for 5-mans being Spirit Link Totem. Once the totem's down and the tank and any other damage dealer are inside of it, it would be almost impossible for the tank to die, and that can go a long way when you're pushing times. Astral Shift as a 40% reduction, 1.5 minute defensive CD is easily the highest impact of any healers, and a lot of healers don't even have one. They also have a ranged interrupt where most healers don't have any interrupt. Spirit Walker's Grace plus Gust of Wind talent solves a lot of their problems of mobility, and can also have the talent option for Wind Rush Totem, which essentially functions as a poor man's stampeding roar. Their DPS, however, is quite limited, and it's also fairly mana intensive. Probably the worst DPS healer out of all the specs, but they do have amazing utility. They have Bloodlust and Lightning Surge Totem, which is an AoE stun, and those two things can be extremely important for any group comp. And they do also still have Purge, which can be useful in the right situation, but unfortunately I'm not 100% sure what can and can't be purged. So if you guys do know, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tier 2, number 1. Number 3 overall is Disciplined Priest. Fundamental changes to the kit of a Disciplined Priest makes a skilled pilot the best option on the planet for 5-mans, but unfortunately an unskilled pilot the worst option. You need to work harder than any other healer to be able to solve basic problems that a healer has to deal with regularly, but absorbs can still be invaluable, and Power Word Barrier can be the best CD available for certain mechanics. Any type of healing the group can provide is exponentially important for Disciplined Priest. Therefore, they can be very group dependent in terms of their success. They're also very limited in options if all 5 players suddenly need healing. And a group that simply refuses to keep themselves alive or play to their best ability is easily the worst possible situation for a Disciplined Priest. They really become useless if players are going to constantly be taking damage and not allow them to focus on smooth DPS focused healing. Their damage is obviously the most consistent of any healer and also has the potential to be the highest of any healer, which is an incredibly useful tool that can be seen evident as far back as MOP CMs. Any damage you can get from the healer role just simply makes the dungeon go smoother, and on top of an actual healing component, this really synergizes well with most basic group comps. Unfortunately, they have almost no utility, very weak at all if anything, but their damage trades off onto this, so that should really be considered a utility in its own right. They do have Mind Control, which has some niche applications such as the Haste Aura in Archway from the Nightborn Reclaimers. They also have Shining Force, which can be useful in Necrotic if you need to kite. It's basically a talented 70% slow and then a knockback around the target you put it on. So you can put it on the tank, tell him you're about to put it on him, it'll knock all the mobs back and they'll be slowed, and then you can run away from them to keep Necrotic from stacking up. They also still have Angelic Feathers, but they've just been nerfed so hard since MOP, it's hard to love them anymore. They can still be useful, but in general, Disciplined Priest's true strength comes from their ability to do consistent, smooth damage throughout the entire dungeon, and the fact that they still have some nice absorb healing to be done as well. Tier 2, number 2, number 4 overall is Holy Paladin. Devotion Aura can naturally be the greatest tool any healer has if used properly. This means standing in a way where just a tank and yourself split it. This equates to a permanent 10% damage reduction for both you and the tank and is incredibly strong as a passive ability to bring to a dungeon. They also have the original oh shit button in Lay on Hands, still as strong as ever. Some incredibly versatile talents that can help paladins do their job in 5-mans exceptionally well, including the Beacon tier, one of which also is Crusader's Might on the first tier. If focused on damage with a good pre-pot, easily able to do more bursts than actual damage dealers of equal gear levels. This can be the single greatest asset any 5-man group could even ask for, as evidenced in MOP and WoD CMs, but can also be very difficult to master, especially in higher Mythic Plus levels. It's very difficult to know exactly when and where you need healing as you're traversing up the high Mythic Plus levels, and sometimes it's simply not possible at all to do damage on any type of encounter. They are easily the most bulky of any healer. Extra health naturally, Devotion Aura, Bubble and Bop, and Divine Protection as a 20% reduction on a 1-minute CD. A good paladin should simply always survive any mechanic in a dungeon. Anybody who dies as a paladin is not playing their kit properly. They also have strong CD coverage, probably the second best out of all the healers. All those CDs are very important for damage as well, so you need to learn where and when you can do either, and that can be very difficult for a lot of players, especially given the need may arise on trash before a boss. You can't always just save all your CDs for bosses in 5-mans, especially in some ones that have much more difficult trash than others. They still have Blessing of Sacrifice, which is a 30% reduction external, but it has a huge downside, that being the learning curve of its shared damage to the paladin. And unfortunately, they are dead last on utility. They basically have nothing. They can take Blinding Light, which can act as an AoE interrupt, and Bop can mitigate some problems, but in general, they have absolutely no utility for the group, and they don't even have an interrupt anymore, which is just a slap in the face for the Holy Paladin. Tier 3, number 1. Number 5 overall goes to Mistweaver Monk. I feel their healing feels very clunky for 5-mans. Heals that can be considered group heals don't respond fast enough, and single target heals take a while to get multiple targets up to full. They have a pretty fun DPS rotation though that can actually be one of the best for all healers, but it does require them to be in melee, and they no longer are melee flagged like Holy Paladin is. Revival is a great answer to many problems in Mythic Plus, plus, but it's the only answer. And in higher difficulties, it does not complement the kit enough to be compared to abilities like Tranquility. They do have great mobility, but limited healing can be done while moving, unlike a Druid who also has great mobility. Life Cocoon can be the highest impact external as it actually absorbs instead of reducing a percentage of damage, but they have no defensive. They have to rely on Healing Elixir's talent for any bulk whatsoever. Not having a defensive as a healer is absolutely absurd. They do have the third best utility though, including an AoE stun and a 70% speed boost for a single player on a 30-second CD. Frankly, a lot of my issues come with how poor their kit plays out for 5-mans. It seems really ideal for slow-paced raid healing. For 5-mans where it's constant input of damage, it's very difficult to keep up as a Mistweaver Monk. Number 6 overall. Number 2 on tier 3 is of course Holy Priest. And before I explain why I feel they're the worst healer for 5-mans, I just want to say that they are superseded in every way by Discipline Priests. It's another spec within the priest healing spectrum, so if you're going to do 5-mans, I would vastly consider Discipline superior. Once again, these are just my opinions. Regardless, let me tell you a little bit why I feel like they are the worst healer. They do have strong throughput and talent synergy to increase HPS exponentially, but that can actually hurt pretty bad in overflowing, especially via the Trial of Light talent. Divine Hymn actually does a lot of healing if used properly, but it can be difficult to apply and use in most issues, especially considering a very similar ability, Tranquility, can be cast fully on the move. They also lack a defensive, which is absolutely absurd if you ask me for a healer. And even with the trait that allows Guardian Angel to be cast on self every time you use it on the tank, it's still very difficult to survive some abilities without a real reduction CD, especially at higher levels. Because of this, dying can be common for Holy, but if used right, Spirit of Redemption can actually be an aggressive way to finish a difficult encounter. They have great potential for good damage in lower keystones especially, and have capabilities of healing what is needed to be healed in just a few globals, but they have very weak utility if any at all, just like Discipline really. They have Mass Dispel and Life Grip, both have, but there's limited to no usage for these in most dungeons. They have no interrupt, but they do have a single target stun, so that is better than Discipline in that way, and of course Chastise is that. And then they have Mind Control, some niche applications like we described. Haste Aura in Arcway from the Nightborn Reclaimers is a good example, and they also have Shining Force and Angelic Feathers. They can be incredibly strong in terms of pure HPS, but unfortunately Discipline's damage and absorb healing is just invaluable and superior in all ways to reactionary healing, especially when you're pushing high level Mythic Plus. So from my experience, that's how I see all 6 healers ranked for Mythic Plus dungeons. Hopefully I've explained myself in a way that was concise and that you could at least respect. A lot of people just tend to throw an insult out there when they disagree instead of actually giving their opinions. I would love to hear your guys' opinions, and honestly, I am certainly less experienced in a lot of these classes than some of you may be. So if you guys feel like I was unjustifiably cruel to some specs, then I would love to discuss that, and we could talk a little bit about ways that I could have tweaked the list. Regardless, we have done now all 3 main roles, so that's DPS, tank, and healing. So the next thing I'll probably do is once the tier set bonuses come out, we'll readdress where Mythic Plus is at that point, and definitely be starting from scratch on DPS, as the tier sets are going to drastically change a lot of the playstyles and throughput capabilities. So anyway, thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions at all, please leave them. Otherwise, see you guys in the next video.